And with that, we will conclude program 5.1, and we will thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate it. And I will now call officers from the Australian Communications and Media Authority to the table. Fatima, do you have questions for ACMA? Well, I'll put you on the list and you can let me know. I'll put you on the list and then you can know. Good sharing. Huh? Sharing. Everyone's being I've still got chilly ones going. Welcome. Welcome, Ms. Narendra Lachlan, Chair, and colleagues. Would you care to make an opening statement?
Narendra Lachlan, Chair, Australian Communications and Media Authority. No opening statement, thank you. Happy to take questions.
We will launch straight into questions and we'll start with Senator Davey.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your appearance again today, and thank you for your ongoing reporting of Australian content, which always makes for very interesting reading. However, this year it's not all good news, unfortunately, in the reports, particularly when it comes to reporting on the increased spending on SVODs, streaming video on demand services. The report for the 23-24 financial year does show an uptick in expenditure from the preceding year, which was decidedly lower than the year before that. But can we identify, is part of that uptick potentially because of expenditure on sports, particularly during an Olympics year?
Senator, I might... I think for the 22-23 financial year reporting, SVODs reported around $70 million on Australian sport, and in 23-24 reported $103 million, just over $103 million on Australian sport. I don't think, I'll ask my colleague, Ms Field, but I don't think we know whether that's attributable to Olympics year.
So we don't know whether it's Olympics or just general sport?
Thank you, Senator. Autumn Field, General Manager, Content Division. No, we don't know whether that is a direct correlation with the screening of the Olympics, but can confirm that there were expenditures in relation to sport. So
sports expenditure between the 2 years went up $33 million, whereas expenditure on Australian content, I haven't got the totals in front of me, sorry, but the increase in expenditure wasn't quite 33 million between the 2 years.
There was an increase, sorry, from my figures, 22-23, the total expenditure by SVODs on the Australian program was just over 324 million, and in 23-24 was 341.5 million.
Yeah, so, okay. Increase of expenditure of 20 million, increase in sports expenditure of 33 million. So sports going up, drama, documentary.
Children's drama came down considerably.
Yes.
Australian documentary came down, but Australian drama went up from 195 to 201 million.
Yes, and that that is a concern that Australian children's content has got to its lowest levels since reporting started, which was in 2019-20.
I don't have the previous years on that.
That's correct.
I do.
Ms Bill has indicated you are correct, Senator.
Yes. And I note, and before anyone yells at me, I do understand that the removal of children's content quotas was done under our government, so mea culpa. But this government has been in place for nearly 3 years and has not reversed that despite at the time when the children's content quotas were taken out, having a lot to say at the time. We haven't heard anything from the government since. But in 2019-20, when children's content quotas were required, there was 101 hours of children's content, and in 23-24 there was only 35 hours. That's quite a decline.
Yes, Senator, it is.
I also note that from what I can work out, most of the commissioning of children's content has been done by the ABC, some 18 million, whereas others are only about 3 million. And when we're talking about others, that's all others, isn't it? That's SVODs, that's free-to-air.
And looking at my notes to try and add things up quickly. So I think that's probably right, Senator. Look, I think it's fair to say that free-to-air commercial broadcasting no longer plays in the children's drama space, and that's partly because of the economics around children's programming, and also that children were moving away from free-to-air broadcasting to particularly the ABC with the introduction of ABC2. There was a big shift of children to those, mainly because, of course, that was considered a safe zone for children as well, because there was no advertising. So we have seen that shift over time. The streamers have done some children's drama, but we really haven't investigated with them what their reasoning is for reducing what they're doing. It seems to be it's just choices that they're making.
And just to be clear, despite the ABC is clearly still spending money on children's content, when you report on Australian content quotas on free-to-air TV, you don't report on the ABC.
No.
So the ABC is outside the content quota.
There are no reporting requirements on the ABC of their expenditure on Australian content.
Yep. Just on content quotas, I know my colleague Senator Hanson-Young had a question on notice last year, question number 163. Where, in response, ACMA stated that reports on content expenditure by SVODs is data provided on, and I quote, a set of agreed metrics which has been refined through consultation between ACMA and the SVOD providers over time. Are those metrics publicly available?
I don't believe they are, and it is an arrangement which is a voluntary arrangement with the SVODs at this point in time. I'm happy to take on notice whether or not we could provide those to you, Senator.
Because all other data sets that are defined through the Broadcasting Services Act, they're all clear and publicly available. I acknowledge it is a voluntary situation at this point in time, but
we are using the same definitions for reporting around what is Australian for the SVODs as we are for other content providers, but we'd be happy to take that on notice for you, Senator.
That would be appreciated. With the figures that are reported to you on a voluntary basis, how do you verify and check the integrity of those figures?
Oh, Senator, I might ask my colleague, Ms Fraser.
Alana Fraser, Executive Manager, Content Safeguards Branch. So there's a process over a couple of months where we receive the data from the SVOD providers. There is some back and forth around verification to make sure the numbers make sense and speak to each other. I can take on notice some further detail about the specifics of that verification process, but just to say that there is a back and forth that happens over a period of months.
Okay, that would be very much appreciated if you could take that on notice. And I also note that there is a lot of public interest in knowing when there's reporting of the expenditure figures, how much of that expenditure is actually made up of what is then provided as a tax rebate, because that's not broken down at the moment, is it?
No, it's not, Senator.
Last question, Senator Davey.
That's all from me. I'm happy to pass on.
Senator Hanson-Young.
Thank you. Ms O'Loughlin, I asked you some questions last estimates in relation to the decency and appropriateness of the Kyle and Jackie O show. You took some questions on notice and we've got answers back on some of those. Question number 45. You refer to on the 18th of November 2024, this was during that period, ACMA opened a new investigation into the Kyle and Jackie O show in relation to comments broadcast on July 6, 2024. The complaint alleges the broadcast contained sexually explicit content and that they did not receive a response from the broadcaster as required by the code. What's the status of this, quote, new investigation?
Senator, I might start there and then I might give you a bit more of an update of the actions we've taken since our last discussion. So that particular investigation there are actually two existing investigations around the same program because they're different licensees, and that is pointed around explicit sexual content and failure to respond to complaints. We're in the final stages of that investigation, so I expect that that will be settled in the coming weeks, and we will make our findings public at that point.
Could I do want an update on all of those other complaints, but could I just ask this, and I'm reading from your answer to my question, that it included, the complaint alleges broadcast contained sexually explicit content and that they did not receive a response from the broadcaster as required by the code. Can you explain to me what that means? Is it that the radio station is just ignoring?
As you would be aware, under the current provisions in the BSA, complainants need to go to the broadcasters first.
Yes.
They can come to us if they don't receive a response in an appropriate timeframe. They can also come to us if they're not satisfied with the response. And I think in this circumstance it was that they were not satisfied with the response from the broadcaster.
Sorry, Senator, if I might, it was actually in this case they did not receive a response from
They
the
did not. They did not receive a response. So there's all this vile rubbish being broadcast on the radio. A listener or makes a complaint to the radio station, the broadcaster, and they're not even being given a response. That's effectively what you're saying here.
Exactly, which is why we're investigating it, and it is a requirement under the code for them to respond. So that's the subject of the investigation.
And you're in the final stages of that investigation.
Yes, we are, Senator.
How long do you think that we are from having a response?
Weeks? Yeah. Weeks.
Weeks. Thank you. I also asked some questions in relation to the number of complaints that the broadcaster had received, and you've given us some answers. There's hundreds of them. what will ACMA do to stop this rubbish being broadcast on air in this way?
Well, Senator, perhaps I can give you an update since our last discussion, when you provided some examples of content which were of concern to people. So we had not received complaints about that content. We had these 2 investigations going on about different content, but we hadn't received those particular complaints. After being provided that information by you, we contacted ARN, who are the licensee involved. We requested the material which was the subject of those matters that you identified to us. They provided that to us in late December. We have reviewed all of that content and we have opened a number of investigations around some of that content, but we've also decided to do a broader investigation about whether there are systemic issues in the program, which is allowing content of concern to go to air, whether that content breaches the code of practice, and that investigation is underway.
That was going to be my next question. Was obviously if we're playing whack-a-mole with individual complaints on such a show that is so prolifically broadcasting this type of sexist, misogynistic content, makes it very hard. I think a more systematic investigation is required. And the reason I say this is because even just since the 20th of January, there is a litany of content that I've been given that is in the same at the same level of what I presented to you last time.
Senator, we'd be pleased to get that information from you. As I said earlier, it is sort of surprising to us, and this is something we need to think about as a regulator, that we're not getting complaints on the program itself. So, but if you're receiving material, we're very happy to look at that and include that in our systemic investigation.
So, are you saying that individuals or community organisations or, you know, mums or dads who are sick of having this rubbish playing on the radio, that they don't know how to put in a complaint to you, or that you're just not getting them at all?
I think that's something that we would like to think about. That people should know that they can come to us if they have concern right across radio and television. And I think it's just surprising to me that we don't get
It's a flaw in the system, do you think? That the complainants have to go to the broadcaster only then to just be ignored, as we've found out?
That's a particular circumstance. The other circumstance may be that they are satisfied with the response that they get from the broadcaster, so they don't come to us. But I think it is worth us thinking about making sure that people know that they can complain to us.
All right. Well, I have a whole litany of things from the 20th of January that I can give you.
Thank you, Senator.
So I will. Has this show... have you ever taken direct action as a result of an investigation into the Kyle and Jackie O show?
Yes, Senator. We've in the past taken two particular enforcement actions. So 17th of March 2023, we accepted an EU from ARN following findings of a breach of decency in relation to comments about the Paralympics. And on the 8th of August 23, following a breach finding in relation to comments about MPOX, the licensee agreed to extend the EU. Now, I might just ask Ms Field or Ms Fraser to talk about what the content of that EU actually is.
Thank you. Senator, the EU broadly requires the licensee to confirm the employment of a second censor for the program for a period of 2 years, so there's now 2 censors required on that program, to update and deliver code training to include sensitivity training, undergo an independent audit of its systems and processes, report to the ACMA within 3 months on the independent audit, and report to the ACMA every 6 months for 2 years. years. So we have received 3 6-monthly reports required under the EU, and we have assessed the ARN as meeting those obligations in relation to that specific enforceable undertaking, and the 4th and final report of that EU is due to us on the 17th of March this year.
Could I have a copy of those 3 reports, please?
Senator, I'll take that on notice for you. I don't have them in front of me.
I'd like them tabled.
Available on the ACMA website as well.
Yeah. You said sensitivity training. Who would that be directed at?
I might ask Ms. Fraser.
I think there was a broad range of people within the organisation that was aimed at. We might need to take that on notice in terms of the detail. But it was, producers and the censors, and I believe the broadcasters as well.
So you've asked for sensitivity training. Has Carl Sandilands done this training?
The presenters were required to do training under the EU, and we believe, and as part of the assessment of the EUs, we understand they've undertaken that training.
Back in 2023?
Might just take on notice the timeframes of when they did the training and the requirements of the EU around how frequent that training.
Do you think the training's worked?
I think this goes to why the ACMA is having that more systemic look at the show, because we know that we have this enforcement action on foot, and we know that these are the requirements that are being met under the EU, but there are obviously still concerns about the content that's being broadcast, so that's something for us to consider as part of the investigation.
And that's why we factored in that we really should look at a more systemic investigation, given that we have taken action previously, and we're still getting material which is of concern to people, particularly on the same matters in terms of the decency provisions in the CRA code.
Well, I'd be interested to know whether you've got any evidence that Mr Sandilands has done any of this training and what the content of that training was, because from what I can see, he's learnt nothing.
We'll go back over.
And we're going to rotate the call now, but if you have anything further you want to provide the Senator, please do so on notice. Senator Payman, did you have questions for this section? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, or good, yeah, almost. Given the government's recent decision to abandon the Combating Misinformation and Disinformation Bill, does ACMA believe current self-regulatory arrangements under the Australian Code of Practice on Disinformation and Misinformation are sufficient?
Senator, we'll continue our oversight role of the voluntary code on mis and disinformation. We will continue to work with Digi and the platforms who are signatory to that code. We, in our reports to government, including the 3rd report which was delivered last year, have continually raised some issues that we see in the code. And I think the major point that we are concerned about is the transparency of what the platforms are doing to address the provisions in the code, and whether those actions are sufficient and whether they're effective. So that's where we're very focused in our discussions with the platforms. I'm not sure my colleague wants to add to that.
No, I think that's right.
So just on the having concerns around the quality and consistency of transparency reporting, this is September 2024 report that you just referred to. Is ACMA engaging with platforms to establish those clear performance benchmarks, and what's been the response so far, if you have made recommendations?
So, Senator, you're correct. We provided our 3rd report to government in September last year. We indicated that there was still ongoing concern in the Australian community around mis and disinformation. We accepted that the platforms were providing some insights into things by the provision of case studies, but we felt that their transparency reports that they provide to us actually lack sufficient levels of consistent Australian trended data, either by individual signatories or across signatories, and there were data integrity issues as well. So we find the transparency reports aren't really giving a full view of what the platforms are doing and how effective the actions they're taking are. So that will be a matter that we will be continuing to discuss with them. We also have wanted them for some time to develop some key performance indicators that they could be assessed against. That hasn't happened to date. So we do remain concerned, but again, we will be working with the platforms to see that whole framework improved.
Absolutely. So you've just mentioned stronger governance and better reporting frameworks. In the absence of legislative powers, what mechanisms does ACMA currently have to hold platforms accountable for mis and disinformation?
Senator, it remains a voluntary code, so we don't have powers.
So would you like to see it being strengthened and pushed further than just a voluntary code? Or
We, in our first report to government in 2020, indicated that we would strongly support legislative approaches.
okay.
So we were very supportive of the bill.
Yeah. Your report, because I did read your submission, your report discusses international regulatory developments, particularly in the EU and UK. What lessons has ACMA taken from these models, and what do you hope or believe that Australia should pursue a similar approach?
I think the EU is probably the main area of interest for us about how they've progressed their legislation, but that's also emerging in the UK as well. We do a lot of discussions with fellow regulators internationally to learn from what they're doing and to apply that here. Of course, there's only a certain amount that we can do while it remains a voluntary code. But we similarly are aligned with our colleagues internationally around really pushing the transparency issue of platforms so that people can have some confidence that they are actually putting in place measures to address mis and disinformation.
Thank you. I've got another set of questions, so if you want to rotate, we can come back.
I
or
would
can
make
I?
the most of the time you have
Beautiful.
now. If I were you,
Fantastic.
We're sticking
Well,
hard to
I was
time.
just-
You've got 10 minutes, you've only used 5, so
Beautiful.
please go ahead.
Well, it will be another 5. Just under the News Media and Digital Platforms Mandatory Bargaining Code, news publishers are registered under the code are entitled to be paid by digital platforms for their news content, and these publishers must be subject to one or more sets of editorial guidelines. Can ACMA revoke a registration under the Mandatory Bargaining Code where a news publisher demonstrates a flagrant disregard for the Australian Press Council standards or violates its own nominated editorial standards?
Senator, the register that we keep, we do an assessment at a point in time of the news sources that are to go on the register. We do have the power to revoke, so I'll pass over to my colleague.
Yes, thank you, Senator. So we assess whether a company meets a number of tests under the code, and if they failed to meet those standards or they changed over a period of time, we could remove them from the register, but the current requirements are in relation to the Australian audience test. So does the news source predominantly operate in Australia for the purpose of Australian audiences? Professional standards tests around whether the news source is subject to professional standards, revenue tests, and then a corporations connection test. So those are the tests that we determine eligibility to be registered, and those would be the criteria against but yes, we are able to remove people.
Fantastic. And so what happens when there's repeated non-compliance, which basically indicate a failure to meet the professional standards test that's required for registration?
So, Senator, I'm happy to take that on notice and provide you with some more information. I'm not aware of any allegations of repeated non-compliance that have come to us.
Okay. And I guess what's been brought to my attention is the Press Council had investigated the Daily Telegraph in regards to 46 separate matters. And of these 46, the Daily Telegraph was found to have violated the standards of practice 57% of the time. That's what I was a bit curious of. How can a news outlet break the rules more than 20, on 26 separate occasions, and still be described as a subject to the standards of practice under the Competition and Consumers Act. So if you could provide more information on notice, that would be helpful. Is there an independent enforcement panel that regularly audits registered news publishers to determine if they uphold their chosen editorial guidelines?
No, Senator, but we have been internally looking at who's on the register, and I think probably more from the point of view, as Ms Field mentioned, whether they're continuing to reach those tests for which they were assessed when they originally went on the register, particularly, the Australian test and are they providing public interest journalism? So we have been doing some internal audit around those tests just to make sure that those people are on the register should still be on the register. That work is ongoing at the moment.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Chair.
Thank you. We'll go to Senator Darmanin.
Thank you. I had some questions about the media release that was published this morning about new protections for victim survivors of family violence. So just wondering if you could talk a bit more about what's being proposed here to strengthen customers experiencing family violence, and also talking about why these have come about, so gaps in existing frameworks that you're seeking to address, and how that will work.
Thank you, Senator. I might start and then I'll pass over to my colleague. We have been concerned about the telcos, how the telcos assist and support victim survivors of domestic and family violence for some considerable length of time. The existing rules were only contained in a guideline for the industry rather than it being included in codes. So we worked, and we were very aware that the Minister was very concerned about this issue as well. So we worked very closely with the Department and the Minister to understand the issue. The Minister directed the ACMA on the 10th of December last year to make an industry standard, and we have released that standard for public consultation this morning. I'll pass over to my colleague about what that's intended to achieve.
Thank you. Kathy Rainsford, General Manager, Consumer Division, ACMA. So the draft standard we've released for consultation this morning would require all telcos, so retail telcos, to to have and implement policies and procedures around how they interact with victim survivors of domestic and family violence, and sets out some proposed minimum requirements around those policies and procedures. It would require that telcos publish a statement so that it is clear what assistance is available to DFE victim survivors. It would put in place minimum training requirements for staff, and that training is required to be informed by experts in the DFE field. It proposes a range of substantive protections around things like disconnection of services, methods of communicating with DFE victim survivors, prohibitions on telcos in any way requiring a victim of domestic and family violence to engage with the alleged perpetrator as they try to sort out whatever's going on with their telco services. There are some additional proposed security and privacy protections for DFE victim survivors, and assurance programs that would be required to be implemented and oversighted at a senior management level. Now, as I said, that's a consultation we've put out there. In the recent months, we've done a lot of some targeted consultation with experts in this field. So that's included, for example, the 1800 Respect Stakeholder Panel, Women's Services Network, the First Nations Advocates Against Family Violence, the First Peoples Disability Network, Caxton Legal Centre, and members of our Consumer Consultative Forum, which includes the Consumer Action Law Centre, the Isolated Children's Parents Association, Safe and Equal, and the Regional Rural Remote Coalition, Communications Coalition, among others. We've also talked to the telcos to better understand their existing practices and a range of engagement across government, including the E-Safety Commissioner, the Family Safety Area of the Attorney-General's Department, the First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group, and the Department of Social Services 1800 Respect team. So that's informed what we've put out for consultation today, and we're looking forward to feedback over the consultation period. We've also scheduled 2 workshops, one for consumer advocates where we can work through what they're seeing, what they think we might have missed, where they think we might have miscalibrated what seems to be working, and also one with industry so we can understand their views ahead of obviously considering all of the feedback we get post the consultation and making that standard by the 9th of June.
And Senator Dunn, if I may add, this is obviously a high priority for Minister Rowland. She wrote to ACMA in October last year, directing them to undertake this work. We're really pleased to see the progress that is being made, and I think at a personal level, Senator, you will recall how frustrated we were in the previous government that so little action was taken to deal with some of the systemic issues that women were routinely confronting when they were trying to work through some of these large bureaucracies that were inadvertently placing additional risks in the paths of women who were surviving violence at that time. This is one of many steps that have been taken to make sure that we have systemic protections in place for women, in addition to some of the core services that we are also funding and delivering.
Yeah. That is an amazing amount of work in such a short period of time in terms of consultation and involvement of stakeholders. That's really great to hear. And so just to confirm, it'll be ready for the 9th of June implementation. Is that...
So the standard needs to be made by the 9th of June in accordance with the Minister's direction. We're consulting on what is the best timeframe for the protections to start after that. There may be a case that some start immediately, that some need to be delayed. And in part that reflects feedback from the consumer advocates in this space, that it is important that appropriate arrangements are put in place to meet those protections, and there's a balance to be struck between making sure that we don't see unintended consequences through the implementation, but we're certainly working on the basis we want all protections in place at the earliest possible opportunity.
And the consultation process is really an opportunity for us to hear from the broadest group available to help inform us come up with a standard which will be put in place as quickly as possible and deliver for victim survivors.
Yeah, that's great. And who will be responsible for the enforcement?
That will be us.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Great, thank you. We'll go to Senator Little.
Thank you. Continuing with that theme, can I ask how many complaints is ACMA receiving each month from family violence victim survivors regarding technology-facilitated abuse of any kind?
I think technology facilitated abuse would be a matter for the E-Safety Commissioner, who will be on later today.
In terms of phones? In terms of...
technology facilitated abuse is under the jurisdiction of the E-Safety Commissioner. In terms of telco
any technology facilitated abuse, you don't include the carriage services in that?
So certainly we're very well aware of the fact that the use of technology, communication services, whether that's broadband or mobile or the like, can be a vector for the perpetration of abuse in there. In terms of the ACMA's remit, we don't generally have a complaint, we're not a direct handler of complaints from members of the community about those services. So we don't generally get those sorts of direct complaints.
Okay. You did say before, Chair, that you were becoming aware of increasing issues. So I'm asking you, how do you know that? What are you getting in your figures, in your complaints?
Yeah, so certainly, Senator, through our engagement over a number of years now, with particularly with advocates for consumers, whether that's ACAN, the peak body for telco consumers, the Consumer Action Law Centre, a range of other stakeholders. We've heard over time of concerns brought to their attention by people about who are experiencing domestic and family violence, who are experiencing difficulties with getting appropriate and safe services when they're engaging with their telcos. In follow-up to that, as under the compliance priority we set in the last financial year, we went in and did an audit, if you like, of a number of telcos' practices around this, and that added to our concern that there weren't enough protections in place, which contributed in effect to the outcome that the Minister directed us to make this standard.
Right, but you don't have any quantitative data in which you've made this decision available to you that I don't know about. There's no new data. You haven't got specific data. You've just got information from consultations with people in the sector.
Senator, I think the officials just informed you that they undertook an audit and that informed the decision taken by the Minister.
No, that's an audit. That's not actually data that actually tells me that you've actually got something that tells you that there's been an increase.
We have a lot of information from particularly those advocacy groups, and a lot of the information that came to us reflected specific cases that they were seeing, which were very disturbing, particularly on the point of telcos requiring a victim survivor to come into a store with the perpetrator of the violence to change their account. So we were given quite extensive information, quite detailed information from those advocacy groups. We also looked at stats from the TIO, I would expect, which is where people need to go to complain about their telcos. So it was really pulling all that information together, which we were able to advise the Minister of what we were observing, which were of great concern, and therefore moved to a direction and putting in place the standard.
Right. So you talked about the guidelines being already in place. So what protection does the standard provide above and beyond what you couldn't get from the guidelines?
The guidelines were not enforceable. So that's the main point. The standard is enforceable by the ACMA. Did you want to talk about detail? I think we've included some of those things that were in the guidelines in the standard, but significantly expanded it.
Yes, that's correct.
So in terms of the exemptions for different providers, are there exemptions in the standard?
No.
There are no exemptions in the standard?
No, so it's a draft standard that we've put out at the moment, but at this point it is drafted in a way which it would cover all retail service providers.
So you're not expecting anyone would be exempt from this?
No, well, no. That's not reflected in the draft. Yeah. Obviously, we might get feedback around that which will need to be considered, but no, we're working on the basis the protection should cover the entire industry.
So I just want to ask about, you mentioned compliance. What will trigger because we all know that implementation is key. You can make an announcement, but it doesn't mean that it actually does anything.
Yep.
What is it that triggers for you to do something or to act on something?
So there are a number of things that could trigger action by us, Senator. Typically, as a starting point, when we put new rules in place, we do a range of proactive audits against sectors of the industry to check that they have uplifted their practice and are complying with the obligations in the new standard. In addition to that, we regularly engage with the TIO to understand what they're seeing. Have they got any concerns around around the escalated complaints they're getting that might warrant us having another look. A number of those consumer advocacy groups regularly share information and data with us, which we routinely look at to see whether it raises any concerns around compliance with the requirements. Likewise, we get quarterly complaints data directly from the top 30 or so telcos, so that's covering most of the market. And if that shows up that there were indications that that a particular telco may not be complying with their obligations, whether it was this standard or something else, that would trigger investigations too.
And Senator, if I can just add to that, just as an example, as Ms Rainsford said, one of the things that the standard requires is that telco must have a domestic and family violence statement which is publicly available about what they will do to assist victim survivors. So that would be something which would lend itself to us auditing from a particular date that the telcos have delivered on that statement.
All right. So if I look at the standard, I can't see any reference to penalties or implications for non-compliance.
That's in the broader, that would be in the broader Act rather than the standard itself.
So you wouldn't put that out there for
talk
consultation for people to
That's provisions that are encapsulated in the Telecommunications Act, that, and it's the same suite of enforcement powers which covers everything from formal warnings through to being able to accept EUs through to infringement notices and civil penalties being available. And I think there are some other powers available that would apply across any breach of any standard that is made under the Telecommunications Act, and that same suite would be applicable to this standard we're made.
Thank you. Thank you. I think
Senator Davey, you've got 1.5 minutes to play with.
I just want to, and notwithstanding that I know telecommunications complaints go to the TIO, but has ACMA received any complaints about the shutdown of the 3G network?
Yes, Senator, we have. We received a range of complaints. I think.
So, Senator, since the shutdown in late October, we've received about 270 inquiries/complaints from members of the public around which we attribute to the 3G shutdown. So most of those related to the device blocking arrangements that were put in place, so people being concerned that their devices were blocked for a range of reasons. There were very few about coverage issues. At this point, we've looked at all of those, including in some instances working with the relevant mobile network operators to understand what's happened.
So to be clear, the device blocking arrangements, this was people who had a device that wasn't 4G, 5G compatible, that they may have been aware that they or that was 4G compatible but not necessarily linked to the VoIP, VoLTE.
The main requirement was making sure that the device would be able to connect to 000.
That's right.
And if it could not support a call to 000, then the telcos would block that device.
And the decision to block, however, was not taken by the telcos. That was a decision of the Minister?
Yes.
Yes, it was.
That was a direction from the Minister to us, and we put in place the standard.
And with the complaints that you've received, have you investigated, were people made aware that their devices would be blocked on?
I think, Senator, this has come up very strongly in the 3G committee, that there was a huge amount of advice given to consumers across the country about what they might need to do, including the availability of being able to tell people quite easily whether the device they had would be able to continue to be used after the shutdown. So I think there was quite a lot of public communication around the issue. I think in all these transitions there's probably some learnings we can take from it about how that communications was made and whether it was successful.
Because at the last estimates we did hear that
Last question.
the device blocking decision that was taken by the minister, but she did not put out a press release. There was no press release from government to announce this would occur, and the telcos were only advised the week before that it was their responsibility to advise customers.
So, Senator, the telcos were certainly aware from the point the Minister directed the ACMA that they would be subject to rules around blocking from when those last two, the Telstra and Optus 3G networks shut down. We worked very closely with the telcos over the intervening period as we worked up the amendments to the emergency call service determination. That determination itself had some minimum requirements for customer notification in them, both for the initial period and now that we're in an ongoing or more business as usual environment, a series of notifications customers are required to get over I think it's 28-day period before their devices are blocked.
And Senator, if I can just add that the Minister directed us on the 21st of August, so that would have been made public, and the amendments to the emergency call service determination came into effect from the 28th of October. So the telcos were very well aware of what was intended during that period.
And we'll need to rotate the call. We'll go to Senator Hanson-Young.
Thank you. It's been reported, Ms O'Loughlin, you would be aware that your agency has been engaged in swapping of press releases with the big telcos, Optus and Telstra, before you issue statements in relation to enforcement action. Is that correct?
It's a requirement for us to actually engage with regulated entities on matters that may affect them. As part of that, so we provide them with our investigation reports. We also provide a short period of time for them to factually check a media release. It is not a drafting exercise between us.
Why couldn't they just be given a copy of the press release embargoed? Why do they get to give feedback on it?
Effectively, we give it to them under embargo to check facts. Sometimes, for example, the legal entity may have a slightly different name, and really it is just a matter of a risk mitigation exercise to make sure we get the facts right before we make something public.
How often has this occurred?
It occurs regularly across, not just in the telco area, but we also do the same due diligence with things like broadcasting investigations.
Have you ever sent a draft press release to the Carl and Jackie O show?
It would not. Our communication would not be with the Carl and Jackie O show. It would be with the licensee.
Have you ever sent a draft press release or statement to the licensee?
I'd have to check, but I would expect it's usually standard practice, and I'd add that it's standard practice of most regulators.
You do understand the perception that this creates.
Yes.
When you've.
And we would say that in the criticisms that came forward, we've gone back, we've looked at our processes. We think they're appropriate. Also, given some of the requirements under our legislation, that we do advise people in advance where there might be reports or the reporting of those reports in a media release prior to those being released. So we think that our practices, we have taken on board the criticisms, we've looked at our practices, but we think they're appropriate.
The press releases that I'm particularly interested in, the ones in the ABC report from the 27th of January, you'd be aware which ones I'm talking about. the report from the ABC. Telco regulator, that's you, under fire over deal with Optus that slashed fine. You understand the case I'm talking about?
Senator, and as I said,
No, I just want to be clear. We're talking about this. You understand the issue I'm talking about?
Yes. And
Yep. Could I please have a copy of the press release that was the draft press release that was sent, and then in these cases, and then the final that was released on notice, please?
Certainly.
Thank you. In relation to the actual issue, how does the regulator justify cutting a deal with these big telcos, Optus in this particular case, to slash the fine for Optus after they had breached serious public safety rules which impacted over 200,000 Australian citizens?
Senator, and we did put out a statement correcting the record. We consider that that ABC report misconstrued and misunderstood the role of the regulator and how we go about our business. We have a range of powers available to us for achieving compliance and enforcing the rules. That can range from things like a formal warning to a remedial direction, infringement notices, enforceable undertakings, and of course going to court, as we've done with the Optus data breach. We use those mechanisms flexibly, and in that process there is naturally a discussion with a regulated entity about what will be the best enforcement outcome to get them into compliance. So we reject the fact that it's a deal. It is a negotiated outcome.
That sounds like a deal to me.
It's a negotiated outcome where we are sitting on the side as the regulator to say what is going to deter them continuing the behaviour, but also, particularly with enforceable undertakings, what are they going to do to make sure they're compliant in the future? These are processes and discussions that are undertaken by pretty much every regulator, and we think they are consistent with our obligations and they deliver outcomes that are suitable in the circumstances.
I guess that's the question, and it goes to this the report by UTS in relation to the enforcement of telecommunications and consumer protections, which I understand you have disputed the findings for.
Yes.
And these are figures that have come directly, that have been made available via the public release of the agency itself. And people are starting to question whether ACMA is more of a lapdog than a watchdog.
Senator,
and
I reject that
I struggle to see how that is not an accurate description.
Senator Hanson-Young, I don't think name calling is appropriate.
Senator, we have raised our concerns with ACAN. We think that that report underrepresents the extent of compliance and enforcement activities undertaken by the ACMA. We also think it was a point of time. We have undertaken extensive compliance and enforcement actions since that report, including 12 formal warnings, 2 remedial directions, 20 directions to comply, 2 enforceable undertakings and payment of close to $7 million in infringement notices. We also filed civil penalty proceedings against Optus in relation to its September 22 data breach, and in November 2024 we announced that Optus had paid a $12 million in penalties after breaching its obligations around emergency calling during its November 2023 national network outage. So we believe that we are taking making appropriate responses to where we see compliance and enforcement issues, using the broad powers that we had, directed towards what sort of harm is involved in those, and we stand by that record. We also accept, though, that ACAN has concerns about the regulatory framework, and we understand those concerns, and that's a continuing discussion between us.
Do you believe that ACMA needs stronger powers of enforcement?
We've talked today about the domestic and family violence standard. We've also introduced a financial hardship standard.
In relation to cracking down on the big telecommunications companies, do you think you need stronger powers?
Perhaps the official could conclude her answer to your question.
I think
we are short on time,
Senator,
I'd like some direct
question,
responses.
I think the bill before the Parliament at the moment will provide us with a significant additional power, so we don't have to go through this two-stage process on code. We think the registration scheme, which we've advocated for many years, will be a really important intervention to make sure that we can also deregister fly-by-nighters who are causing harms to consumers. So we strongly support that, plus the increase in civil penalties. Plus these new standards coming in, as we discussed earlier, give us more powers than we have under codes.
Final question, because I know we're running tight of time. Could you please advise on the amount in penalties the industry has avoided due to these EU arrangements or deals or negotiations that ACMA has conducted?
Senator,
you'll have to take that on notice.
No,
I suspect.
I'd like to address it. Infringement notices are provided. The company can choose to accept the infringement notice or not pay it.
A deal.
No, they cannot pay it. That's the way infringement notices work, right across the Commonwealth.
I'm asking how much these big corporations have avoided having to pay because of the way that you're conducting your complaints and investigations.
Senator, that is completely speculative and would require us to think about what a court might decide. We would not go to court in many of these cases.
What about when you offer Optus a fine from $3 million down to $1.5 million? How many times have you done that? And how many times
Senator Hanson-Young, I will ask you to come to order. I'll ask you to come to order.
With all due respect, Chair,
Senator Hanson-Young,
Ms O'Loughlin is not answering the question.
Senator,
that's incorrect.
Okay, if everybody could just stop. Thank you. It's my job to keep order in here, and having everybody shouting at each other does not qualify. Senator Hanson-Young, you've asked a question. You're not enjoying the answers. That doesn't mean that that is not the answer that is appropriately provided by the witness. Maybe I need to ask the
question more clearly.
Okay, ask your question.
How many incidences, such as what you arranged with Optus, where they got to choose between the $3 million and the $1.5 million fine, how many times has this occurred and how much has it saved these big corporations?
Senator, as I indicated at the outset, these are negotiated outcomes. They also involve the negotiation of enforceable undertakings, which require investment by the company to make sure they ensure future compliance. So
but we've just seen from Kyle and Jackie O, that's rubbish.
Please allow the witness to finish the answer.
The Kyle and Jackie O might be a particular circumstance. We don't see that with the enforceable undertakings that we see in the telco sector.
So what are you doing differently with the broadcasters then? You're not holding their feet to the fire enough? What is the difference? You're saying these are the mechanisms you've got. We've got proof on one hand that it's not working, and you want us to believe that it's working when it comes to the big telcos.
Senator, I think it's a little hard to understand what question you're actually asking.
I'm asking why the watchdog won't be better at holding corporations to account. That is your job.
Well, Senator, I think the official has told you that the approach they are taking is to bring the regulated community into compliance, and they have a range of tools to do that. Ms O'Loughlin has stepped out to you exactly how they use those tools and their objectives, which are to have a community in compliance. The goal here is to have a regulated community that is operating within the rules.
And Senator, if I can just add very quickly, we do have different rules under the Broadcasting Services Act and the Tel Act, but I won't go into further detail.
I would like on notice how many instances you have struck an agreement where the fine has been reduced.
We will consider that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Billick.
Thank you.
Nice to see you again, Ms O'Loughlin.
Thank you, Senator.
ACMA has been provided with funding to implement the new media diversity measurement framework. I'm wondering, when will the first report be released?
Thank you, Senator. So we've been developing the media diversity measurement framework, which is really to look at the levels of diversity across Australia's news media landscape and inform government decision-making in support of public interest journalism and media diversity. It has been a very large project for us. The current measures around media diversity are really just focused on what we call the Voices test in the Broadcasting Services Act. We're of the view that, particularly with the growth of online sources of news, that there should be a broader look at what diversity means in the contemporary environment. So we've done a huge amount of work on that. We are getting close to releasing the first report, but I might ask Ms Field to talk about the framework and how we're going about it.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
As Ms O'Loughlin said, we are in the very final stages. We're just in the editorial process, and we anticipate that the report will be released in coming weeks. And so it has been delayed by a little bit. We were hoping that we would have it out.
Hansard, can we just turn up the volume a bit for me? Thanks.
Sorry, apologies, Senator.
No, it's me. I've got a hearing.
We had hoped to have the report out at the end of the year, but there were some particular complexities with the volume of data that we have been assessing coming in from multiple sources and the need to ensure that quality of data. So it will be coming out there. The framework is looking at 6 key indicators. So the first 3 indicators relate to groups, controllers and owners, professional news work and professional news outlets. These relate to source diversity. The 4th indicator relates to content diversity. So that's the extent to which content presents different voices, different viewpoints and demographic profiles. And the 5th and 6th indicators are around news consumption, trust and impact. So the report will be accompanied by 6 Power BI reports that will allow people Power BI reports, so interactive reports where people will be able to go in and pull out particular areas of interest to them, and that will accompany the written report.
So you mentioned the 6 key indicators. Are you able to tell me anything about the findings of the first report, or is that still because the report hasn't been released yet?
We haven't released the report as yet, Senator, but I would say that it's taken us a little longer than we expected to get to finalising the report for publication, mainly because it's a very complicated set of data that we're pulling together. Some of that data is readily available. Some of it currently isn't readily available. So alongside with the report, we'll also be releasing what we think are the next stage of the reporting on news media diversity, which will require us to do quite a bit more work on getting additional data, research that might inform the report. So it's very much an initial report at this stage.
Okay. And are you able to talk to me about the recent media mergers and acquisitions? What's that mean for media diversity in Australia, namely the proposed Paramount 10 acquisition of Win assets and the proposed DAZN DAZN acquisition of Foxtel?
Senator, I think in all those cases they actually don't raise regulatory issues for us under the Broadcasting Services Act, so I wouldn't have a view beyond that.
That's correct, Senator. None of those at this stage.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, well...
Can I just, sorry, Chair, I just
yes.
have one question.
Go right ahead, Senator Hanson.
I'm going to have a lot of questions on notice in relation to those 2 matters I've already raised with you. But I just wanted to ask broadly about the current ACMA board. Do you have your full makeup of the board at the moment, Ms O'Loughlin?
Senator, at this point, the former Deputy Chair, Karina Chapman, retired in December last year. There is a process that is being undertaken by the department to appoint a new Deputy Chair to the organisation. In the meantime, Carolyn Ledgerwood is acting as Deputy Chair. So currently we have 4 full-time members where we usually have 5.
And could you just tell me, of those 4, does that include you as Chair?
Yes.
Yes. So of the 4 of you currently that make up the board, do you all come from industry backgrounds?
I do not come from an industry background, Senator. I come from
the other 3?
Yes.
Could you table for us a list of the previous backgrounds of the board members, please?
The current board members?
Yes, thank you.
Certainly, that's included in our annual report.
Yeah.
But we're happy to take that on.
Thank you. And, Minister, when do we expect the Deputy Chair position to be filled?
There may be departmental officials who can provide advice on that. Otherwise, I'll need to take that on notice.
Okay. All right. Do you have any idea, Ms O'Loughlin, or it's just up to the government to decide? Or
that's a matter for the Minister, but we understand that the matter is very well progressed.
Yep. You'd expect it to be done before the election?
I don't think we can comment on that, Senator. I've taken it on notice, and if there is more information...
How long has the position been vacant?
So Ms Chapman retired in December last year, so it's only a couple of months.
Only a couple of months. Okay. All right. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. We'll now suspend. We'll release ACMA. Thank you so much for coming and spending some time with us. We will return, unlike the program which says returning at 2, we will return at 1:45 with the ABC. Thank you.